I think all of these ideas, the messages implicit in these mediums, are wrong. Let's think about Twitter. In fact, the word is complex. To reflect that honestly, you usually need to focus on one thing for a significant amount of time, and you need space to speak at length. Very few things worth saying can be explained in 280 characters. If your response to an idea is immediate, unless you have built up years of expertise on the broader topic, it's most likely going to be shallow and uninteresting. Whether people immediately agree with you is no marker of whether what you are saying is true or right. You have to think for yourself. Reality can only be understood sensibly by adapting the opposite messages to Twitter. The word is complex and requires steady focus to be understood. It needs to be thought about and comprehended slowly. Most important truths will be unpopular when they are first articulated. I realized that the times in my own life when I've been most successful on Twitter, in terms of followers and retweets, are the times when I have been least useful as a human being, when I've been attention deprived, simplistic, vituperative. Of course, there are occasional nuggets of insight on the site, but if this becomes your dominant mode of absorbing information, I believe the quality of your thinking will rapidly degrade. The same goes for Instagram. I like looking at pretty people like everyone else, but to think that life is primarily about these surfaces, getting approval for your six pack or how you look in a bikini, is a recipe for unhappiness. And the same goes for a lot of how we interact on Facebook too. It's not a friendship to pour jealously over another person's photos and posts and complaints and to expect them to do the same for you. In fact, that's pretty much the opposite of friendship. Being friends is about looking into each other's eyes, doing things together in the world, an endless exchange of gut laughs and bear hugs, joy and grief and dancing. These are all things Facebook will often drain from you by dominating your time with hollow parodies of friendship. After thinking all this, I would return to the printed books I was piling up against the wall of my beach house. What I wondered is the message buried in the medium of the printed book before the words convey their specific meaning. The medium of the book tells us several things. Firstly, life is complex, and if you want to understand it, you have to set aside a fair bit of time to think deeply about it. You need to slow down. Secondly, there is a value in leaving behind your other concerns and narrowing down your attention to one thing. Sentence after sentence, page after page. Thirdly, it is worth thinking deeply about how other people live and how their minds work. They have complex inner lives just like you. I realize that I agree with the messages in the medium of the book. I think they are true. I think they encourage the best parts of human nature. That a life with lots of episodes of deep focus is a good life. It is why reading books nourishes me. And I don't agree with the messages in the medium of social media. I think they primarily feed the uglier and shallower parts of my nature. It is why spending time on these sites, even when by the rules of the game I am doing well, gaining likes and followers, leaves me feeling drained and unhappy. I like the person I become when I read a lot of books. I dislike the person I become when I spend a lot of time on social media. But I wondered if I was getting carried away. These were just my hunches, after all. So later, I went to the York University in Toronto to interview Raymond Marr, who is a professor of psychology there. Raymond is one of the social scientists who has done most in the world to study the effects that reading books has on our consciousness, and his research has helped to open up a distinctive way of thinking about this question. When he was a little boy, Raymond read obsessively, but it had never occurred to him to try to figure out how reading itself might affect the way in which our minds work until he was a grad student. And one day, his mentor, Professor Keith Otley, put a thought to him. When you read a novel, you are immersing yourself in what it's like to be inside another person's head. You are simulating a social situation. You are imagining other people and their experiences in a deep and complex way. So maybe, he said, if you read a lot of novels, you will become better at actually understanding other people off the page. Perhaps fiction is a kind of empathy gym, boosting your ability to empathize with other people, which is one of the most rich and precious forms of focus we have. Together, they decided to begin to study this question scientifically. It's a tricky thing to study. Some other scientists had developed a technique where you give somebody a passage to read and then immediately afterwards you test their empathy. But to Raymond, this was flawed. If reading affects us, it reshapes us over the longer term. It's not like coming up on ecstasy, where you swallow it and experience immediate effects for a few hours. With his colleagues, he came up with a clever three-stage experiment designed to see if this longer-term effect existed. If you took part in the test, you were brought into a lab and you were shown a list of names. Some were famous novelists, some were famous non-fiction writers, and some were random people who aren't writers at all. You were asked to circle the names of the novelists, and then separately, you were asked to circle the names of the non-fiction writers. Raymond reasoned that people who had read more novels over their lifetime would be able to recognize the names of more fiction writers. He also now had an interesting comparison group, people who had read a lot of nonfiction books. Then he gave everyone two tests. The first used a technique that's sometimes used to diagnose autism. You are shown lots of pictures of people's eye areas, and you are asked, what is this person thinking? It's a way of measuring how good you are at reading the subtle signals and that reveal the emotional state of another person. In the second test, you sat down and watched several videos of real people in real situations, like, for example, Two men who had just played a squash game talking to each other. You had to figure out what's going on here, who won the game, what's the relationship between them, how do they feel. Raymond and the experimenters knew the real answer, and so they could see who in the test was best at reading the social signals and figuring it out. When they got the result, they were clear. The more novels you read, the better you were at reading other people's emotions. It was a huge effect. This wasn't just a sign that you were better educated, because reading nonfiction books, by contrast, had no effect on your empathy. I asked Raymond why. Reading, he told me, creates a unique form of consciousness. While we are reading, we are directing attention outwards towards the word on the page, and at the same time, enormous amounts of attention is going inwards as we imagine and mentally simulate. It's different from if you just close your eyes and try to imagine something off the top of your head. It's being structured, but our attention is in a very unique place, fluctuating both towards the page, towards the words, and then inwards towards what those words represent. It's a way of combining outwardly directed attention and inwardly directed attention. When you read fiction in particular, you imagine what it is like to be another person. You find yourself, he says, trying to understand the different characters, their motivations, their goals, tracking those different things. It's a form of practice. We are probably using the same kinds of cognitive processes that we would use to understand our real peers in the real world. You simulate being another human being so well that fiction is a far better virtual reality simulator than the machines currently marketed under the name. Each of us can only ever experience a small sliver of what it's like to be a human being alive today, Raymond told me. But as you read fiction, you see inside other people's experiences. That doesn't vanish when you put down the novel. When you later meet a person in the real world, you'll be better able to imagine what it's like to be them. Reading a factual account may make you more knowledgeable, but it doesn't have this empathy expanding effect. There have now been dozens of other studies replicating the core effect that Raymond discovered. I asked Raymond what would happen if we discovered a drug and that boosted empathy as much as reading fiction has been shown to in his work. If it had no side effects, he said, I think that it would be a very popular drug. The more I talked with him, the more I reflected that empathy is one of the most complex forms of attention we have, and the most precious. Many of the most important advances in human history have been advances in empathy. The realization by at least some white people that other ethnic groups have feelings and abilities and dreams just like them. The realization by some men that the way they have exerted the power over women was illegitimate and caused real suffering, and realization by many heterosexuals that gay love is just like straight love. Empathy makes progress possible, and every time you widen human empathy, you open the universe a little more. But as Raymond is the first to point out, these results can be interpreted in a very different way. It could be that reading fiction over time boosts your empathy, but it could also be that people who are already empathetic are simply more drawn to reading novels. This makes his research controversial and contested. He told me that it's likely that both are true, that reading fiction boosts your empathy, and that empathetic people are more drawn to reading fiction. But there's a hint. He said that reading fiction really does have a significant effect. One of his studies found that the more a child is read storybooks, something their parents, more than the kid, choose the better they are at reading other people's emotions. This suggests that the experience of stories really does expand their empathy. If we have reason to believe that reading fiction boosts our empathy, do we know what the forms that are largely replacing it, like social media, are doing to us? Raymond said it's easy to be novelish about social media and to fall into a moral panic, and he finds that way of thinking silly. There's a lot that is good about social media, he stressed. The effects he is describing aren't to be primarily with the printed page, he said. They are to do with being immersed in a complex narrative that simulates the social world. His studies have found that long TV series are just as effective, he said. But there's a catch. One of his studies showed that children are more empathetic if they read storybooks or watch movies, but not if they watch shorter shows. This seems to fit, it seems to me, with that we see on social media. If you see the world through fragments, your empathy often doesn't kick in the way that it does when you engage with something in a sustained, focused way. As I talked with him, I thought we internalize the texture of the voices we're exposed to. When you expose yourself to complex stories about the inner lives of other people over long periods of time, that will repattern your consciousness. You too will become more perceptive, open, and empathetic. If, by contrast, you expose yourself for hours a day to the disconnected fragments of shrieking and fury that dominates social media, your thoughts will start to be shaped like that. Your internal voices will become cruder, louder, less able to hear more tender and gentle thoughts. Take care what technologies you use, because your consciousness will, over time, come to be shaped like those technologies. Before I said goodbye to Raymond, I asked him why he had spent so much time studying the effect of reading fiction on human consciousness. Up to the moment when I asked this, he had been something of a data geek, explaining his methods in great detail. But as he answered, his face opened up. We are all on the same bowl of mud and water that is heading towards a catastrophic end potentially. If we are going to solve these problems, we can't do it again, he said. That's why I think empathy is so valuable.